In front of the majestic Buckingham Palace, a tourist dared to defy centuries of royal tradition. While dozens of cell phones recorded every moment, she got closer and closer to the royal guard, ignoring all warning signs. What happened next shocked hundreds of people and became one of the most viral videos of that week in London. The sun shone over the majestic towers of Buckingham Palace on that summer afternoon in London. The movement was intense, with hundreds of tourists amazed by the grandeur of the place. Among them, some people whispered and pointed discreetly at the imposing figure that stood out in the crowd. A royal guard, perfectly aligned in his traditional red and black uniform with the iconic furry hat that seemed to defy gravity. The gentle breeze lightly swayed the leaves of the centuries-old trees that decorated the palace gardens, while the buzz of visitors filled the air. The guard stood absolutely still, as if he had been carved from marble, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his impeccable posture reflecting centuries of tradition and discipline. His boots gleamed in the sunlight, and his saber gleamed, strapped to his waist in a silent display of authority. A child ran past the guard, her footsteps echoing on the ancient stones of the courtyard, as her mother called her back with a worried whisper. The guard didn't even blink. Its presence was more than just decorative. It was a living reminder of the history and protocol that made it one of the most respected spots in England. Little did those present know that, in just a few minutes, that seemingly ordinary afternoon would turn into a memorable moment when someone decided to challenge not just one man, but an entire centuries-old tradition. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to have access to more stories like this. The hubbub of the crowd suddenly subsided when Emily appeared, crossing the courtyard with purposeful steps. Her flowery and eye-catching dress contrasted with the sobriety of the place, as did her golden bag that glittered with every movement. Her blonde hair, tied in a poorly done bun, betrayed her rush to be the center of attention. With a smug smile on her bright red lips, she gestured as she spoke loudly on the phone, completely ignoring the disapproving looks from the other visitors. Emily seemed oblivious to the solemn environment that surrounded her, as if the palace was just another setting for her private performances. Between one shrill laugh and another, she began posing for selfies, getting closer and closer to the royal guard. Her loud comments made it clear that, for her, everything there was nothing more than a major tourist attraction. "This is all just theater," he declared with conviction to anyone who would listen, while adjusting his sunglasses on his head. An elderly woman nearby shook her head in disapproval as Emily put her cell phone in her purse and began examining the guard from top to bottom, like someone analyzing a statue in a museum. His behavior revealed not just ignorance, but a profound disrespect for the centuries-old tradition he was about to challenge. What no one imagined was that his next actions would transform that afternoon into a memorable moment for the most unexpected reasons. The provocations started subtly. Emily approached the guard, waving her fingers in front of his face as if testing his concentration. "Hello? Is anyone in there?" he asked in a mocking tone, eliciting some nervous laughter from the crowd that was beginning to form. Dissatisfied with the lack of reaction, she began to circle around the guard, like a predator studying its prey. "Wow, how can you stay so still? This job must be really boring, right?" he continued, progressively raising his voice. The guard remained impassive, his eyes fixed on the horizon, although a soft vein began to throb in his temple. A young tourist tried to discreetly intervene. "Ma'am, please, this is not appropriate." But Emily completely ignored her, turning her attention to the guard's impeccable uniform. "That hat must weigh a ton, and look at that coat. How much does all that production cost?" he commented, getting closer and closer. The audience watched with a mixture of embarrassment and apprehension. Some tourists began to move away, predicting that the situation could evolve into something more serious. Others whipped out their cell phones, anticipating something memorable was about to happen. Emily, completely absorbed in her private performance, seemed unaware that she was about to cross an invisible but very real line of respect and decorum. The public's reactions intensified with each new provocation from Emily. Cell phone cameras appeared in all directions, while murmurs of disapproval echoed through the palace courtyard. A Japanese family exchanged worried glances, and a mother quickly pulled her children away from the unfolding scene. "This isn't going to end well," a man in a suit whispered to his wife, who was watching everything with wide eyes. The previously relaxed atmosphere now carried palpable tension. Grace, a young student who knew local traditions well, bit her lip nervously as she typed a message on her cell phone. "You won't believe what's happening here at the palace." People gathered in an ever-widening semicircle, as if watching an unscheduled play. The sound of social media notifications began to fill the air, mixing with comments in different languages. "She's completely out of her mind," a lady commented in French to her tour group. The tension rose like a silent wave. Some more experienced visitors had already witnessed similar situations and knew exactly where it could end. The guard, although he maintained his impeccable posture, now had his nostrils slightly flared, the only visible sign that he was aware of everything that was happening around him. Emily, however, seemed to feed off the growing attention, completely oblivious to the fact that she was about to star in a moment that would long be remembered in that historic location. The moment everyone feared has finally arrived. With a provocative smile on her lips, Emily took 2 determined steps beyond the safety line clearly marked on the floor. The crowd collectively held its breath, as if watching a scene in slow motion. The sound of her footsteps on the gravel seemed to echo with an unnatural intensity in the sudden silence that had fallen. "How does it feel to use that sword? It must be quite heavy, right?" she asked in a mocking tone, stretching her hand towards the guard's ceremonial saber. His fingers with perfectly painted nails came dangerously close to the weapon that represented centuries of tradition and respect. At that instant, even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing. A small child tugged at his mother's coat sleeve and asked in a low voice, "Why is she doing this?" only to receive a silent gesture in response asking her to be quiet. The air grew thick with the tension of the moment as Emily, completely absorbed in her own audacity, moved even closer. With a deliberate movement, she not only surpassed the established physical limit, but also crossed an invisible boundary of respect that separated the ordinary world from the centuries-old traditions of the royal guard. His fingers were inches from the saber when the unthinkable happened. The moment that would transform that ordinary afternoon into a memorable episode was about to unfold before the wide eyes of dozens of witnesses. The silence was broken by a precise and calculated movement. The guard, who had previously looked like a living statue, abruptly turned towards him. His eyes, previously fixed on the horizon, now stared at Emily with an intensity that made her instinctively step back. The movement was so sudden that she almost tripped over her own feet. "Make way for the Queen's Guard!" thundered the guard's voice, deep and authoritative, reverberating through the palace walls. The words, although traditional, carried a weight that made Emily instantly pale. His face, previously marked by a mocking smile, now expressed a mixture of surprise and fear. With a single fluid movement, the guard positioned himself between her and the sacred site she had tried to desecrate. His stance showed no anger or irritation, just an unshakable authority built on centuries of tradition. The rifle in his hands, once a decorative piece, now seemed to remind everyone of its true function. "Step back, madam," he ordered again, his voice carrying a strength that did not allow for questioning. The audience, which seconds before had been completely silent, now watched the scene with a mixture of amazement and admiration. The guard's transformation from static figure to active authority was so impressive that some spectators let out sounds of awe. It was as if everyone finally understood that this uniform wasn't just a costume, and this man wasn't just part of the tourist scene. "What do you mean?" Emily protested in a high-pitched voice, taking a step back more out of reflex than out of obedience. "I came from the other side of the world to see this place. I paid a fortune for the ticket. I have every right to enjoy the full experience." Her words echoed across the courtyard as she gestured wildly with her hands, the golden bag swinging violently on her arm. The indignation in her voice grew with each word, as if she were the true victim of the situation. "This is a tourist attraction. You're here to entertain people, aren't you?" Some nearby tourists exchanged looks of disbelief. A middle-aged man shook his head in disapproval as his wife whispered something in his ear. Emily, however, seemed to feed off the negative reactions, raising her voice even more. "You can't treat me like this. I'm going to complain to the palace administration. This is absurd." His face was red with anger now, contrasting with his previous paleness. She took her cell phone out of her bag with sudden movements and started filming, pointing the camera directly at the guard. "Everyone will know how you treat tourists here. This is discrimination. I know my rights." But his voice, once so confident, now carried a note of desperation, as if he finally realized that he had made a serious mistake that could not be easily corrected. A sudden movement stirred the crowd as two palace security guards discreetly emerged from a side door. Mr. Bennett, the most experienced of them, approached with firm and determined steps. His serene but authoritative expression made it clear that the situation had come to an end. "Ma'am, I need you to accompany me," he said in a tone that brooked no objection. Emily, still holding her cell phone with shaking hands, tried to argue, but her voice no longer carried the same conviction. "But I was just," she began, being interrupted by a firm gesture from the security guard. The crowd naturally parted, some quietly applauding as Emily was escorted out. His protests gradually diminished, as did his previously haughty posture. A few meters away, a teenager commented to her friend, "She's going to have a lot of explaining to do when this video goes viral." The royal guard, fulfilling his role masterfully until the end, returned to his original position with a precise and disciplined movement. The scene had an almost cinematic air. As Emily disappeared down a side corridor, escorted by security guards, the guard resumed his statuesque pose, as if nothing had happened. Tourists, still processing what happened, began sharing their recordings on social media, turning the moment into a viral reminder about respect and tradition. There was a feeling of restored justice in the air, as if the history of the place itself had been defended that afternoon. The comments from those present mixed admiration for the guard's attitude and disbelief at Emily's behavior, which would now serve as an example of what should not be done in such a respected place. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to have access to more stories like this. The last rays of sunlight from that memorable afternoon bathed Buckingham Palace, painting its walls a soft gold. The royal guard remained at his post, as imposing as the palace walls themselves. His red and black uniform remained impeccable, as if the events of the last few minutes had been nothing more than a brief breeze in centuries of tradition. The crowd gradually resumed its normal rhythm, but something had changed. The gazes directed at the guard now carried a new type of admiration. It was no longer just tourist curiosity, but a genuine respect for what he represented. Some visitors made a point of maintaining an even greater respectful distance than before, as if they finally understood the true meaning of that uniform. Social media was already starting to buzz with images of the incident. Several comments praised the guard's firm but controlled stance, transforming that moment into a lesson on the importance of respecting traditions. The video spread quickly, not as another record of confrontation, but as a testimony of how dignity can prevail over foolishness. There, in front of the centuries-old palace, the royal guard was not just a man in a traditional uniform. He was the living guardian of a cultural heritage that has stood the test of time. His unwavering stance in the face of provocation demonstrated that some traditions remain strong not through imposition, but because they genuinely deserve our respect. And so, as the sun set in London, that afternoon's incident was becoming yet another chapter in the palace's rich history, a timeless reminder that certain things are sacred, not because they are ancient, but because they represent values that transcend time.